The courtroom was already full when Thomas Adler walked in carrying something wrapped in burlap. People had driven from both sides of the ridge. Two families who shared fence lines with the disputed property had taken the morning off work. A county extension agent sat near the back, a rolled property map in his hand. The local arborist, a woman named Grace Tan who'd been asked to testify, sat in the second row. Word had spread that Blake Prescott, the investment banker who had purchased the 200-acre property north of the Adler farm 18 months ago, was claiming 6 acres of Thomas's land based on a new GPS survey. The 6 acres contained the only spring-fed stock pond on the eastern ridge. Most people already knew how boundary disputes ended. When a man with a $40,000 GPS survey challenges a farmer with a piece of root, the survey usually wins. But Thomas Adler had walked into that courtroom carrying something the survey couldn't explain. Because buried at the boundary between the two properties was a 90-year-old oak tree, and Thomas had brought part of it underground. The bailiff stopped him. "What's in the cloth?" Thomas unwrapped the burlap. A section of tree root about 18 inches long and thick as a man's forearm. The bark was dark and cracked. The cut end showed tight growth rings, dozens of them, spiraling inward. "Evidence," Thomas said. His attorney, a property lawyer named Owen Glass, who had handled 3 boundary cases in the county, handed the bailiff a document. The bailiff looked at the root, shrugged, and stepped aside. Thomas sat at the defense table and laid the root in front of him. Soil crumbs fell onto the wood surface. Across the aisle, Blake Prescott sat beside 2 attorneys and a licensed surveyor. Prescott wore a pressed sport coat. His laptop displayed the GPS survey, a clean digital line that placed the boundary 6 acres further south than Thomas's fence. Prescott glanced at the root and whispered, "He brought us tea." Blake Prescott had purchased the 200-acre parcel as a weekend retreat. He planned to build a house, a guest cottage, and a private fishing pond. When his surveyor mapped the boundaries using GPS, the digital line fell 6 acres south of the old wire fence that had separated the properties for as long as anyone could remember. Prescott filed a quiet title action, claiming the 6 acres, including the stock pond, had never legally belonged to the Adler family. His surveyor testified that the GPS coordinates were accurate to within 18 inches. At the property hearing, Prescott's attorney had said, "GPS doesn't have opinions. It doesn't have feelings. It measures. And the measurement says 6 acres belong to my client." He did not mention that the GPS survey had been calibrated to a benchmark on Prescott's own property, not the county's official benchmark. The Adler farm had occupied 110 acres since 1927. Thomas's grandparents had purchased the land from a family named Crane. When the sale was completed, both families planted an oak tree on the boundary line. It was 1934. The tree was a shared project, a living marker that both families agreed was the boundary. The tree had grown for 90 years. Its canopy now spread 40 feet, while its roots went deeper. The wire fence that Thomas maintained ran directly through the tree's root zone. The tree was the boundary. Everyone on the ridge knew it. When Prescott's GPS survey drew a line 6 acres south of the tree, Thomas didn't argue with the GPS. He argued with the assumption behind it. The GPS measures where a line is, Owen Glass explained to the court. But it doesn't know where the boundary is. The boundary was set by 2 families in 1934, and they used a tree, not a satellite. Owen spent 2 weeks building the case. He visited the boundary oak with Grace Tan, the arborist. The tree was massive, trunk diameter over 4 feet, canopy spreading 40 feet in every direction. Its root system, according to Grace's ground-penetrating radar scan, extended 70 feet from the trunk in every direction. "This tree was deliberately planted," Grace said. "It's not a volunteer seedling. The root architecture shows it was planted in a prepared hole, likely as a sapling. The symmetry of the root spread is consistent with an intentional planting in open ground, not a forest edge." She took a core sample and counted rings. 89 to 91 years. Planted between 1933 and 1935. Consistent with a 1934 boundary marker. Owen then visited the county clerk's archive, a converted basement under the courthouse that smelled like mildew and old paper. He spent a full day searching through agricultural extension records from the 1930s. Most were mundane crop reports, weather data, soil surveys. Then he found it, a single index card filed under Property Improvements 1934. Handwritten in fountain pen ink, oak planted by Adler and Crane families as boundary marker. Both families present. Extension agent observed. October 12, 1934. Owen held the card up to the fluorescent light. The ink had faded, but was legible. A county extension agent had been there, had witnessed it, had written it down. He drove to Thomas's farm that evening. "I need something from the boundary," Owen said. "The root system extends under both properties. If I can excavate a section of root and show that it grows into both sides, it proves the tree sits on the line, not on either side." Thomas got a shovel. They dug along the fence line 6 feet from the trunk on Thomas's side. At 18 inches, they hit a root as thick as a man's forearm. They followed it toward the property line. It crossed directly under the old wire fence, growing into both properties simultaneously. Thomas cut a section with a handsaw. The growth rings were tight and even. The bark was dark with age. Soil from both properties clung to the surface. Owen wrapped it in burlap. "This root is our case," he said. "A tree that grows into both properties was planted on the boundary, and this one has been growing there for 90 years. The oak had become something of a landmark on the ridge. Locals called it the Adler Crane Oak, though neither family had ever given it an official name. It stood at the northwest corner of Thomas's property, its trunk nearly 4 feet in diameter, its canopy spreading wide enough to shade a truck parked underneath. Thomas's grandfather had told the story many times. In 1934, the year after the Adlers purchased their land, there had been a dispute with the Cranes over where exactly the property line fell. Rather than hire a surveyor, which neither family could afford during the Depression, they agreed to plant a tree on the boundary. They chose an oak because oaks were strong, long-lived, and hard to move. Both men dug the hole, both men filled it. The tree was the agreement. For 90 years no one had questioned it. Thomas's family farmed their side. The Cranes farmed theirs. When the Cranes sold to a family named Henderson in 1978, the Hendersons honored the oak. When the Hendersons sold to Prescott in 2024, the boundary had been understood and respected for 90 years, until Prescott hired a GPS surveyor. The problem with GPS was not accuracy, it was reference points. Every GPS survey needs a starting benchmark, a known fixed point from which all other measurements are calculated. Prescott's surveyor had used a benchmark on Prescott's own property, a concrete monument that his previous owner had installed in 2003. The county's official benchmark was located 3/4 of a mile south of the old post office. Owen Glass discovered this during his review of the survey documentation. The two benchmarks were not identical. There was a discrepancy of approximately 23 feet, enough to shift the boundary line from the oak tree to a 0.6 acres further south. Owen told Thomas his entire survey is based on the wrong starting point. "But we need more than a surveying error to win this. We need to prove the tree is the boundary." Thomas thought about this for several days. He walked to the oak every morning that week, the way he had walked to it every morning for 40 years. He knew every branch, every knot, every place where the bark had healed over old wounds. On Thursday, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. On the north side of the tree, about 8 feet from the trunk, a thick root broke the surface for a few inches before diving back underground. The root crossed directly under the wire fence. Thomas got a shovel. He dug carefully around the root following it. The root ran south for about 3 feet, then dove deep. He traced it further. The root system extended both north and south, crossing into both properties equally. He called Owen. The roots go both ways. Into my land and into his land. Equal. Owen was quiet for a moment. And that is because the tree was planted O-end a line. Its roots respect the boundary the way the planters intended, half on each side. Owen hired Grace Tan, the certified arborist, to document the root system. She confirmed the root growth pattern was symmetrical around the trunk, extending roughly equal distances north and south. Soil mineral analysis of the root system showed 2 distinct profiles: Adler soil composition on the southern roots, Prescott soil composition on the northern roots. The tree had literally grown into both properties. Grace also aged the tree at 89 to 91 years, consistent with the 1934 planting. Owen then searched the county clerk's archive. In a box of unsorted documents from the 1930s agricultural extension records, he found a single card, handwritten, "Oak planted by Adler and Crane families as boundary marker, spring 1934. Both families present." Thomas bored a section of root from the boundary area carefully with Grace's supervision, ensuring he did not damage the tree. The section was about 18 inches long, thick as a forearm, with clearly visible growth rings on the cut end. He wrapped it in burlap. Owen filed a defense based on boundary tree doctrine, the principle that a tree planted on a property line by mutual agreement of neighboring owners establishes a legal boundary. He hired Grace Tan, a certified arborist, to examine the oak. She aged it at 89-91 years. She also took a root sample. He searched the county clerk's archive and found something remarkable: a 1-page record from the county agricultural extension dated 1934 that read, "Oak planted by Adler and Crane families as boundary marker." Both families present. Thomas also brought the root. The morning of the hearing, Prescott arrived in an SUV with tinted windows. A reporter asked about the case. "I paid for a professional survey," Prescott said. "The results are clear. I'm not trying to take anyone's land. I'm trying to establish where mine begins." Inside, he told his attorney, he brought a tree root. "We have GPS coordinates to 18-inch accuracy." Now the final hearing had arrived. The judge opened proceedings at 9:20 a.m. Prescott's team presented the GPS survey, the digital boundary map, the surveyor's credentials and methodology. Professional, precise, modern. The GPS coordinates are unambiguous, counsel summarized. "The boundary is where the survey says it is." The judge turned. "Defense." Owen stood. "One exhibit." Thomas stood. He picked up the root and walked to the evidence table. He laid it down. The cut end faced upward, growth rings visible, tight and spiraling. Some soil fell from the bark onto the table. Prescott's surveyor leaned forward, frowning. Owen stood beside the root. This root was excavated from beneath the boundary oak that stands between the Adler and Prescott properties. The tree is approximately 90 years old. It was planted in 1934 by the Adler and Crane families as a mutual boundary marker. He pointed to the growth rings on the cut end. "These rings tell us when this root grew, and the direction it grew tells us where the tree has stood, undisturbed, for 9 decades." Prescott's attorney shifted. The gallery murmured. Owen placed Grace Tan's report beside the root. Certified arborist Grace Tan aged this oak at 89 to 91 years, consistent with a 1934 planting. Root growth pattern analysis shows the tree was planted in its current position. It was not transplanted or moved at any point. Grace Tan stood briefly and nodded from the gallery. Prescott's surveyor whispered to the attorney. Owen placed a second document. Soil analysis from the root shows mineral composition consistent with both properties. Adler soil on the south side, Crane Prescott soil on the north side. The root literally bridges both properties. It grew into both. He looked at the judge. This tree was planted, and the line. Not on one side. In it. And both families soil fed it for 90 years. The courtroom went still. Owen placed one final document. This is from the County Agricultural Extension Archive, dated 1934. Oak planted by Adler and Crane families as boundary marker. Both families present. Bindent has his hand on the route. A GPS survey measures distance from a satellite. This route measures distance from 1934. Two families planted a tree together and agreed. This is the line. That agreement has stood for 90 years. No GPS coordinate can overwrite 90 years of mutual agreement written into the wood of the living tree. The courtroom didn't make a sound. Prescott sat motionless. His laptop screen still showed the GPS line, a clean digital boundary that, as of this morning, ran through the middle of a tree that had been the real boundary for 9 decades. The judge was quiet. The quiet title action is denied, he said. The court recognizes the boundary oak as a legally established boundary marker under the boundary tree doctrine. The property line runs through the tree consistent with the 1934 agreement and 90 years of acquiescence by both property owners. He looked at Prescott. I'd suggest you recalibrate your survey to the county's official benchmark. Your measurements may have other errors. The gavel came down once. Outside, Grace Town found Thomas on the steps. You saved the tree, she said. Thomas shook his head. The tree saved the farm. It's been standing on that line since before I was born. I just brought a piece of it inside, a reporter asked. Were you worried? Thomas looked at the burlap in his hands, the root inside. That oak has survived 2 ice storms, a lightning strike in '74, and a drought that killed every other tree on the ridge. It's still standing. He paused. I figured if it could handle all that, it could handle one lawyer with a laptop. 7 months later, Prescott's surveyor recalibrated his equipment to the county's official benchmark. The new survey placed the boundary within 3 feet of the oak tree. Prescott did not refile. Thomas went back to work. The 110 acres stayed in the family. The stock pond stayed on his land. The oak continued to grow, its roots stretching deeper into both properties the way they had for 90 years. And the root section sat on a shelf in the farmhouse beside a framed copy of the 1934 extension record. The oak still visible through the window, its canopy spreading, its bark carrying no initials, no date, no deed. Just rings, 90 of them, each one a year the boundary held.